I was surveying my local record store the other day when I came across this little oddity. Where the motherland needs us most, there is our home. Now this immediately caught my attention. Firstly, what is it? Secondly, how did it get here? Well, judging from songs like "We are members of the Communist Youth League" and "We car drivers have seen Chairman Mao," it's easy to deduce that this record is a propaganda vehicle for the Chinese government. And sure enough, popping it in on Discogs reveals it was published by China Records, which was owned by China Record Company, which was owned by the people, as in the People's Republic of China. This particular record was distributed by the company Guozi Chudian, an international distributor of Chinese books and music operated by the Chinese Communist Party. In fact, the name straight up translates to state bookstore. They publish works all over the world, usually via mail order, and after 50 years of being knocked about, this record somehow landed in my grubby mitts. But this got me thinking. China's probably been making records for almost as long as the West has. Surely they didn't just stick to recording the classics like "I worked for the revolution as a cook." Well, no, they didn't. The website for China Record Company actually has its own section showcasing the history of recording technology in China. Now, keep in mind, this is Chinese history as told by the Chinese government, which means that they'll happily tell you about the first recorded Peking opera or the first recording of the national anthem. But there's another side of Chinese music history that the state does not want you to know about. A whole genre of music not mentioned in these pages and largely dismissed by the Chinese Communist Party. I am talking about yellow music. What is yellow music? Well, in Mandarin, the word yellow shares the same character with the word pornographic. So, yellow music can also be roughly translated as sexually indecent music. The name yellow music was mainly a derogatory label meant to stigmatize this style of music, and it was a name given to the genre by its detractors. Outside of mainland China, the genre is generally referred to as shidaiqu, which translates to music of the era. It's essentially just the earliest form of Chinese pop music, fairly harmless stuff by today's standards. And yet the government backlash was massive, so much so that after the Communist Revolution in 1949, the genre was outright banned by the Communist Party. Now, what was it with this genre that was so disruptive that the CCP wanted it gone? Well, to really understand why, we need to go back to the turn of the 20th century. At the time, China was in a rather fractured state, dealing with both internal power struggles as well as imperialist expansion from foreign powers. One of these imperialist hotspots was the city of Shanghai, which had become a massive international trading hub, growing into one of the largest cities in the world. Now, since most of Shanghai was controlled by European colonial powers, the city was quite modernized compared to the rest of China, giving it the moniker Paris of the East. In fact, the French, who had significant settlements in Shanghai, were the first to introduce the phonograph to China, and it wouldn't take long until they started manufacturing Chinese recordings. The earliest Chinese phonograph records were recordings of traditional Peking operas. These were recorded in Shanghai, with the masters being sent back to Paris for pressing before being sent back and sold off in China. Alongside these traditional records, they also sold records from all around the world, including music from this quirky new genre called jazz. This turned into quite the hit. Jazz musicians from the US would travel across the pond, where they would play to packed venues, often getting better treatment in Shanghai than they received back home in the US. And it's this hodgepodge of music culture that became the breeding ground for a pop music revolution. At its core, shidaiqu is essentially just a fusion between jazz and traditional Chinese folk music. This right here is the song Drizzle. It was composed in 1927 by Li Qinghui, often dubbed the father of Chinese pop music, and Drizzle is often thought of as the very first Chinese pop song. It is sung by his daughter, Li Minghui, who performs the song in a childlike, nasal tone of voice, similar to how vocals are sometimes performed in Chinese operas.
with ideas that they want to...
No, Li Jinghui really is the kind of artist who represents the Chinese national character. And those foreigners who say that the Chinese people are the most degenerate on earth are entirely correct.
Yeah, while these songs were popular with the Chinese people, they were not as appreciated by the powers that be. Now, the reasons for that are quite complicated, but here is my best attempt at an explanation. Number 1. The May 4th movement. In the Versailles Treaty following World War I, China was given a pretty raw deal. They were forced to secede several territories to the Japanese, including the Shandong Peninsula, which was a very culturally important territory for China. For many Chinese, this was the last straw. They were tired of being trampled by the big international players, and they weren't gonna take it anymore. It was time to decommission the ideas and cultures that had dominated China for millennia, and it was time to update Chinese culture so that China could stay relevant in the modern age. This was the sentiment of the May 4th movement, and this sense of upheaval extended into the musical world. Since most of Shanghai had been under the control of European powers, the city was exposed to a lot of European cultural influence. And as for music, the European music system had a lot of features that the traditional Chinese music system did not have, like equal temperament, tempered scales, and functional harmony. Because of that, many of Shanghai's musical elite deemed the Chinese musical systems to be horribly outdated, and instead saw fit to model China's music in the spirit of Western classical music. Li Jinghui, however, did not follow the Western dogmas to the same extent, composing in the traditional pentatonic scale instead of the Western chromatic one, and often publishes works in simplified notation, basically continuing some of the Chinese music traditions that the musical reformers were actively working to discard. Another factor for yellow music's dismissal was that this new wave of reformist intellectuals didn't just import Western musical tradition, they also imported Western musical attitudes. And just like jazz was heavily stigmatized by the Western musical elite, jazz was assigned an equally low status in the Chinese musical hierarchy. The fact that Li found such success popularizing such an inferior art form was a great source of contention, and yellow music's popularity was seen as a symptom of negative colonial influence in Chinese culture. Number 2. The Sing-Song Girls of Shanghai. With the creation of pop music comes the creation of the first pop stars. And in the 1930s, Li Jinghui launched a myriad of musical troupes, usually all consisting of young women. These women were called sing-song girls, and they were a big part of the emerging cultural landscape in 1930s Shanghai, with many of these women becoming China's first examples of celebrities. Now, the term sing-song girls is fairly encompassing, basically existing on a sliding scale from purely entertainers to straight-up prostitutes. Now, most of the more famous sing-song girls definitely aired more towards the pure entertainer side of things, but the idea of the sing-song girl usually lent itself to more rambunctious connotations, and a lot of these musical troupes definitely played considerably on sex appeal. These musical starlets would not only appear on records, but would also perform at dance halls, nightclubs, and on film. And these performances were not without controversy. In 1934, a film titled Fairies of the Mortal World was condemned as lewd because during the dance sequences, the female dancers in the film exposed their bras and panties. Li Jinghui composed the score for the movie. Indeed, there are a lot of parallels between these sing-song girls and chorus lines, another risque cabaret acts that were popular in Europe at the time. Shanghai had a closer connection to Western popular culture than anywhere else in the country, and was China's epicenter for art, music, cinema, fashion. It was also China's one-stop shop for gambling, partying, drugs, and prostitutes. For the more conservative parts of Chinese society, this new style of pop music was essentially the soundtrack of moral degeneracy, and they feared what influence this style of music would have on Chinese society if left unabated, which leads us to number 3, the power of music. Now this one is interesting. In the 1930s, one of the working theories was that the power of music was largely involuntary. If you were exposed to sad music, you became sad. If you were exposed to upbeat music, you became energized. If you listened to music without a strong rhythm, you became uncoordinated. As a music listener, you had no emotional agency. Instead, you automatically took on the characteristics of the music you were exposed to. Thus, if someone can control your playlist, they essentially have the ability to program your emotions and thus control your behavior. Amongst certain Chinese intellectuals, music was seen as this massive influential force capable of doing great harm if left in the wrong hands. Thus, it was paramount that music which had a bad influence on the people of China, like yellow music, was to be suppressed as much as possible before it corrupted the minds of the Chinese people. Now, in modern times, it's easy to scoff at this logic. While music certainly is capable of influencing behaviors, it's not a straight-up brainwashing tool, as some might have implied. But this idea was not without precedent. The idea that the music you listened to had a direct correlation with your moral standing had been a central viewpoint in Chinese philosophy for over 1,000 years. Confucius himself said that music was created not to satisfy the desires of the mouth, ears, and eyes of man. It was to teach people to distinguish good from evil and to return to the correct way of man. Music was a guiding force in upholding a society's morals. Thus, it was important that the music of China represented a positive change for Chinese society. And at the time, China was engaged in civil war, war against Japan, not to mention trying to stave off colonial powers who had massive control over Chinese society. And because of that, many composers created music that promoted the unification and mobilization of the Chinese people, so that they had a better chance of triumphing against their common adversity. The most apparent power of music is that musical rhythm is capable of conducting the great masses, of unifying the movements of the entire nation. In the West, they often sing an anthem before and after mass rallies. These rally songs have strong, simple rhythms and lyrics appropriate to the occasion. Once the anthem is sung, the spirit of cooperation is greatly increased. Around this time, there was also a greater push to solidify music as a communal activity. This was to increase camaraderie and the morale of participants. And sure enough, engaging with music in a group setting, either performing music as a group or even just listening to music as a group, have demonstrable health benefits. So there was a significant push to remove the risque nightclub music that had taken the country by storm and replace it with a healthier music culture that united the people and strengthened morale. Which leads us to number 4, communism, and the purpose of art in socialist China. All our literature and art are for the masses of the people, and in the first place for the workers, peasants, and soldiers. They are created for the workers, peasants, and soldiers, and are for their use. Mao Zedong. In modern times, it's easy to think of music as an entity without an inherent agenda. And although there are certainly songs with clear, definable meanings or even political messages, sometimes music is just music, you know? Now, Mao would argue that is naive, and that all music takes on certain characteristics of the people who make it and the society they live in. All music is a reflection of the society it's created in, and thus all music is inherently ideological in nature. So the best thing to do in that case is to support music that promotes good ideological values, which in Mao's case meant music that supported the socialist cause. Now, pop music did not support the socialist cause, and so was, at best, a banal distraction, and at worst, a harmful culture glorifying capitalist values. It also didn't help that pop music was a commercial product, usually targeted towards the wealthy. It was entirely for profit, with most of that profit being siphoned overseas to foreign companies who still owned a significant chunk of the record industry. So, after the establishment of the People's Republic of China in 1949, the genre was formally labeled yellow music by the Communist Party and was subsequently banned. Instead, the Communist Party set out to popularize a new style of music, a style that would better facilitate the socialist revolution, fittingly called revolutionary music. Revolutionary music was the main genre of music broadcast by the Chinese government from the 1950s to the 1980s. It gets most of its DNA from Russian orchestral music, but with lead melodies borrowed from or inspired by Chinese traditional music. These songs are composed to be fairly accessible. The rhythms are strong and prominent and great for marching. The lyrics are simple and easy to sing along with, sometimes featuring just a single verse that is repeated continuously. And the songs themselves are often grandiose in scale, usually being performed by large orchestras and choirs in a style typical of military songs. Revolutionary music was ultimately a political tool, and the themes of the songs reflect the sentiments of the Communist Party. One prominent theme was the appraisal of communism and the Communist Party, as seen in songs like "Without the Communist Party, there would be no new China." Another was the support of armed conflicts in service of communist revolutionaries. These conflicts ranged from the war against Japan, the Korean War, the Cultural Revolution, which we'll get back to later, and some songs existed to paint a picture of the model Chinese citizen and what they do to better Chinese society, seen in songs like "Learning to be a Worker." Being that revolutionary music was so transparently a political tool, it means that the song titles become very bizarre and stilted when translated to English. It's hard to imagine a song like "To Consolidate the Dictatorship of the Proletariat, Fight Courageously" having any sort of chart success these days. But it's important to note that while these songs have a clear political agenda, the artists and composers who make them are usually quite talented. And a lot of these songs are, surprisingly, quite good. And revolutionary music did see a fair bit of popularity, existing alongside traditional forms of Chinese music and Western classical music. But all of that would change come the 1960s. Around this time, tensions arose between Mao Zedong and certain factions within the Communist Party. Mao claimed that the CCP had become complacent and bureaucratic, no longer actively prioritizing the communist revolution. On the other hand, China was still reeling from one of the biggest famines in human history, which the Communist Party largely blamed on Mao's mismanagement. Mao's status within the party was quickly diminishing, and he was scrambling for ways to get back to a position of power. So in 1966, Mao Zedong launched the Cultural Revolution, calling upon the nation's youth to take up arms against the corrupt Communist Party and to continue their fight towards the socialist revolution. The advertised end goal of the Cultural Revolution was a total reforging of Chinese culture. Mao claimed that, despite their best efforts, capitalist influence still permeated the nooks and crannies of Chinese culture, and the only recourse left was to erase everything and start from scratch. And so, in 1966, all performance of Western classical music as well as traditional Chinese music was declared counter-revolutionary and subsequently banned. Western classical composers like Mozart and Beethoven were described as a threat to working-class liberation, which, at face value, sounds like a pretty absurd claim, right? Like, how do you even parse any ideological messaging from something like Mozart? Well, in Maoist theory, there is no art without class commentary. Art either exists in service of capitalism or the working class. It's either or. And since Mozart composed his music while living in a feudal society, all his music was inherently tainted with feudal ideology, and thus cannot represent the working class. Same thing goes for traditional Chinese music. Indeed, pretty much the only type of music that could represent the working class was music created with the approval of the Communist Party. And this was used as justification for the suppression and destruction of almost all music in Communist China, allowing state-manufactured music to reign uncontested. "Definitely not ordinary music," said a worker who did not used to be interested in music. "This is new revolutionary music of the proletariat, heard and approved by Chairman Mao, the red sun in our hearts. That's why I wanted to listen to it again and again." After the start of the Cultural Revolution, the production of revolutionary music skyrocketed. And this record, "Where the Motherland Needs Us Most, There Is Our Home," is one of the many records released by China during this time. And one of the characteristics of music from the Cultural Revolution is that it's often used as a vehicle for the absolute deification of Chairman Mao Zedong. Now, Mao was often featured in revolutionary music before the Cultural Revolution, but during the revolution it reached insane levels. Mao and his achievements became a massive overarching theme in almost all music produced. Old songs were rewritten to praise Mao and his policies. Even the national anthem was changed from March of the Volunteers to the song The East is Red, which opens with the lines, "Here in the East rises the sun. China has brought forth Mao Zedong." Alongside its regular usage, revolutionary music became another channel to grow the cult of personality around Mao Zedong, alongside the hundreds of millions of portraits bearing his likeness, and of course, the hundreds of millions of copies of Mao's Little Red Book. This propaganda campaign cemented his status as a benevolent leader within his army of supporters and ensured that he would reign in China uncontested. Now, while books and pictures are easily printed and distributed, music is a different matter. Radio was the obvious choice, and they did do that, but personal radios were expensive and fairly uncommon outside the big cities, and private record players were a luxury item that very few people owned. So, how did Mao and the Communist Party get revolutionary music to the people of China? The answer, in part, was a massive collection of loudspeakers. During the Cultural Revolution, there were over 100 million loudspeakers erected all over China. These were placed all over the country, at places of work, public city squares, and neighborhoods. These loudspeakers played government messaging, important news, and of course, revolutionary music. They would broadcast information at various intervals during the day, and their ubiquity ensured that propaganda messaging and art was regularly interspersed within Chinese day-to-day life. Of course, if you're tasked to build 100 million loudspeakers in the course of a few short years, chances are
they're gonna sound a bit cack.
And they did. Playing any music through these was often pretty rough. This influenced how the revolutionary songs were produced. Almost all of these recordings are in mono and have their upper frequencies boosted, making them shrill as hell, but intelligible, even on the shittiest of speakers. But really, the quality of the speakers didn't matter that much. Instead, having a national broadcasting system like this had great symbolic value. Music was now available for everyone, and the government strongly encouraged creating listening parties, continuing to advocate for music listening as a communal activity. It's also important to note that China is a massive country, and the fact that these broadcasts could be heard by people all around the country simultaneously was a significant feat. It meant that no matter who or where you are in the country, you'd still be hearing the same messages at the same time as everyone else. This created a sense of national media unification that was unheard of in China until then. It was also a logistical nightmare. Yeah, cities might have fancy things like electricity, but there were many places where the best broadcasting technology available was a dude on a roof with a horn. To aid the broadcasting situation, the government actually issued hand-crank-powered record players to far-out villages, because most of the records produced by China Records during this time were targeted towards broadcasting. Now, this one actually had another use as well. It was shipped internationally, hence the English titles and translation work. Mao's propaganda machine extended overseas, and there were plenty of Mao supporters all over the world. The Chinese government produced several newspapers and magazines for the international markets. In fact, they still do to some extent. And these magazines often featured advertisements for Chinese literature and art, translated into various, often European languages. Now, I was unable to confirm if you could order records through any of these magazines, but Guozi Shudian did at least issue pamphlets containing records available for order. Most of these were records containing revolutionary songs and operas, usually coming with a translated lyric sheet. But there were also Chinese classical records available, as well as some more obscure releases like Chairman Mao's 4-minute physical fitness plan. Makes sense. Performed by the Central China Philharmonic Society. Okay, now I'm intrigued.
The great leader Chairman Mao teaches us. Promote physical fitness exercises and improve people's physical condition. We must always be ready to protect our country. 1, 2, 1, 1, 2, 1.
For revolutionary music records like this one, it wasn't uncommon for them to come with both lyric sheets and sheet music. Now, this is a pretty beat-up copy, so these weren't included when I bought it, but it likely did come with them initially. These records were produced regularly up to around the death of Mao Zedong and the end of the Cultural Revolution, after which the strict regulations on music were lifted and revolutionary music slowly lost favor with the general public. But a few years later, revolutionary music would have one last hurrah. In 1991, China Records released The Red Sun, a disco-inspired reimagining of revolutionary music from the Mao era, releasing with a total of 5 discs.
天上太阳红呀红彤彤哎，心中的太阳是毛泽东哎。
It sold like absolute hotcakes and is actually a solid contender for best-selling quintuple album of all time. Go figure. In summary, I'd like to say that this record is part of a very complicated piece of history, one which cannot be explained in a 20-minute video essay without significant compromise. If you want to learn more about this topic, I've left some reading material in the description as well as a list of sources I've used while researching. If you want to see more videos on ethnomusicology, then go somewhere else, cause I'm never touching this again. Actually, you know what? I will make exactly one more video about a different communist country with an even crazier music history, so stay tuned for that. I guess all that's left for me to do now is to play the damn thing. So, to close the video off, here are some triumphant tunes of the proletariat, courtesy of Mao Zedong. Enjoy. Wait, that's the wrong one!